Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, as Sudan's war deepens, the army takes the UAE to court, accusing it of breaching the Genocide Convention by funding the paramilitary RSF. Meanwhile, the army itself is accused of targeting civilian critics. The top opposition leaders arrested in Kenya. Also, as the WFP warns that millions in Somalia are going hungry because of the fallout from a deadly combination of drought, conflict and rising prices, I speak to the World Food Programme's Nutrition Data Analysis Chief about why food security has gone down, even as global prosperity has gone up. And we head to Tunisia, where a new law on cheques is proving to be divisive, as it was brought in to crack down on the number of bounced cheques gumming up the system, but has also made it difficult for some vendors to do business. But first, the UAE's accused Sudan of embarking on a cynical publicity stunt after the army applied to bring a case against the Middle Eastern country over its support for the RSF paramilitary. Now, the filing at the International Court of Justice accuses the UAE of complicity in genocide. Now, the army has been fighting the RSF in a brutal war in Sudan that's killed tens of thousands since 2023. The army itself, though, is accused of leaning on civilian political leaders. On Thursday, a prominent opposition figure was held by police as he arrived in Nairobi. That's where our Olivia Bizo is.
Yassin Arman was arrested as soon as he arrived at Nairobi's airport on Wednesday night, where he was informed of the Interpol arrest warrant issued for him. Now, that warrant was requested by Sudan's army, who accuse him of collaborating with the paramilitary rapid support forces in the ongoing conflict. So who exactly is Yassin Arman? Well, he's an opposition politician who's been involved in the fight against both the military-led government and the ongoing conflict. He was due to meet Western politicians and diplomats here in Nairobi to discuss the ongoing conflict in his country. Now, his supporters argue that his arrest and the charges against him are politically motivated, and they're aimed at silencing opposition figures. So why exactly did Kenya respect this arrest warrant? Well, it's likely the government is trying to strike a balance. Kenya has been hugely criticised in recent weeks for hosting the paramilitary rapid support forces and their allies. They've been here to sign a charter and a constitution aimed at putting in place a parallel government. So by respecting this warrant requested by Sudan's army, President William Ruto is likely trying to say, look, I'm not taking a side in this conflict, and I am respecting my role of mediator for Sudan's conflict for IGAD, which is a regional bloc aimed at ensuring peace and stability in East Africa.
Well, that breakdown for us from Olivia Bizo. Look now at some news in brief. Another ally of the South Sudanese vice president's been detained. The country's peace-building minister, Stephen Parkwom, was arrested on Thursday, following that of the oil minister and deputy head of the army. All three men are members of the Vice President Riek Machar's SPLM-IO party, and their detentions risk destabilising a fragile peace agreement in South Sudan that was struck in 2018 to end a 5-year brutal civil war. Also, at least 10 people have been injured in Mozambique after police fired on a march in support of opposition leader Venancio Mondlane. It happened just hours before President Daniel Chapo had signed an agreement with some other political parties that was aimed at ending months of protest over Chapo's disputed election win last year. Now, Mondlane came second in those polls, but he was frozen out of the talks leading up to the agreement. And Nigeria says it's bringing in new rules for organ transplants in response to growing concerns about the ethics and processes used across the sector. Despite the country's medical expertise, transplants are hampered by donor shortages and weak laws that increase the risk of trafficking. The Health Ministry says that the new framework will boost voluntary donation and transparent allocation to better protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Now, another 1 million people in Somalia risk being pushed further into food insecurity, adding to the 3.4 million already facing critical levels of hunger. The worrying numbers from the World Food Programme warn that a combination of drought, conflict and inflation threatens to leave a quarter of Somalia's population without enough to eat. And all this just 3 years since the country skirted on the brink of famine after the longest drought in its recorded history. Now, 43,000 people died from that, but from Sudan to Ethiopia to Niger, throughout the continent, hundreds of thousands of people are at risk of losing their lives in undernourished communities. Now, Jean-Martin Bauer is from the World Food Programme, and he joins us now to break down why this is such a challenge for the continent and beyond. Jean-Martin, thanks so very much for your time. So we've seen that there's been a rise in global prosperity over the last couple of decades, but that's also been accompanied by a rise in food insecurity. One would think that it would be the opposite. Why is this happening?
Thanks, Georgia. This is happening for a variety of reasons. Number one is conflict. We have about 135 million people who were food insecure, acutely food insecure before the COVID pandemic. That's now risen to 343 million, quite an increase in just a few years. Number one reason is conflict, but also climate has a role to play, as it had in Somalia. We need to know that with this increase in food insecurity globally, we also have an increase in the most severe category of food insecurity. We analysts classify food insecurity through the integrated food security phase classification. That's a 5-point scale. Phase 1 is normal, phase 2 is stress, 3 is crisis, 4 emergency, 5 is catastrophe. About 5 years ago, we had about 100,000 people who were in the most severe category, the catastrophe. Now, we ended the year 2024 with 1.9 million. That's because of the conflict in Gaza and in Sudan. So hunger's gotten, it's affecting more people, it's become more severe, and it's also happening at a time of reduced resources for the international community. And the funding gap to meet these higher needs hasn't been greater in a very long time.
And you've been working in the sector for 25 years. And I know, at least throughout my lifetime, you've seen these cycles of at least some of these like famine crises hitting the headlines. What do you think needs to change? Or have you seen enough change in the way these crises are tackled?
Well, you mentioned the recurrent droughts that Somalia has gone through. Last year, there were 2 rainy seasons in Somalia. Both were well below average, resulting in poor harvests in the south, which is why there's been this alert. Our forecasting shows that the next harvest is itself at risk because there will likely not be enough rain once again. So this is something that happens, unfortunately, again and again in some countries. We've had that case in the Horn of Africa. You mentioned the Sahel. And what we need to do to address this is to prevent and act early. Late response is the problem. So we need to be able to deploy resources well in advance of a crisis developing when we have the forecast or the information that the situation might get worse. That's because 1 ounce of prevention is always worth a pound of cure. And in the humanitarian space, we know that $1 spent in advance in prevention avoids $7 worth of damages. So it's really important to work with anticipatory approaches.
Jean-Martin, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but what you've just said here has triggered a question in that, you're talking about prevention and anticipatory responses. Do the communities who are actually on the receiving end of this, do they play a role?
Absolutely. The other thing that needs to change, and that's something we've already been working on at the World Food Programme, is involving communities to supply the food for the programs in our country. I talked about Somalia over there. The World Food Programme is working with local farmers to supply the food for the school feeding program. We need to work with local farmers, local businesses. We need to work with cash transfers and the local traders. We need to put cash in the money of the population so that they can go buy the foods that they need on the market, creating economic multipliers and jobs and reviving local economies. These are the things that need to change so that we can build more resilient food economies all over the world.
Thank you so much, Jean-Martin Bauer, for breaking that all down for us. Jean-Martin Bauer there from the World Food Programme, talking us through just some of the factors that could perhaps make a longer-term difference in tackling cyclical bouts of food insecurity in parts of the world. Well, we head to Ghana now, where for the first time in 68 years, the country celebrated Independence Day without customary parades and pomp as part of the new president's cost-cutting measures. Our correspondent reports.
Independence Day celebrations have always been big in Ghana. On an ordinary March day like this, streets like what is behind me would have been filled with people and cars, tooting horns, and draped in the red, gold, and green national colors of the country after mass parades have just completed in national, regional, and district capitals. Not any longer. New President John Dramani Mahama says the decision to cut back on these celebrations is to save the country money, as the country is still reeling under one of its heaviest economic crises in about 3 decades.
The state spent 15 million Ghana cedis on last year's celebration in Koforidua and spent 13.7 million cedis on the previous year's celebration in Ho. Today's event would save us 95% of the estimated cost of the event.
This decision to cut back on celebrations have drawn mixed reactions from across people in the capital, Accra.
No, I think it's the best decision the government has ever made, because Nkrumah said one thing, is that until everybody is free, we are all slaves. So if a lot of people or the citizens are not free, and we are celebrating a freedom and wasting billions of dollars or billions of cedi every year, and we don't see the freedom or see it reflecting in the lives of the citizens, then what's the essence of sending it to a big place and wasting millions?
We need to save money to be able to cater for the SHS feeding program, to be able to fix our street lights, to take care of the filth and the debts in the city. I think it's a good one.
Ghana, formerly known as the Gold Coast, was the first country south of the Sahara to gain independence on 6 March 1957.
Some impressive Ghanaians there with their priorities straight. Justice Baidu there for us in Accra. Head to Tunisia now, where a new law on cheques is proving to be divisive. It was brought in to crack down on the huge number of ones that were gumming up the system after bouncing, but it's also caused problems for some vendors. Take a look.
At this grocery store in Tunis, a new law on cheques is stirring debate. But that may soon change. Now anyone whose cheque bounces and who fails to settle the payment in time will be banned from issuing them and could face steep fines and even jail time. For wholesalers, a new 30,000 dinar payment limit for cheque could also cause problems.
Vegetable wholesalers buying foods from farmers need between 400 and 600,000 dinars. Often they can't pay it all at once, so instead they pay some up front and the rest by cheque deposited over several months. Now that's not possible anymore.
This wood seller has seen his business slow since the change.
Normally, I have full stock, but at the moment, as you can see, it's empty. Suppliers no longer accept old cheques, and they don't want to accept credit either. So for me, it has a direct impact on my business.
Across Tunisia, around 450,000 people are wanted by police and 7,000 in prison because of bounced cheques. Prisons are so full that sentences for the crime have had to be reduced. But some businesses appreciate the toughening up of penalties for bounced cheques.
Some people say that with the new system, our businesses will suffer, but I'd rather be sure of being paid than accumulate all these bounced cheques that I have in front of me. With the new checks and their traceability, at least we have some form of insurance.
Some economists worry that the new law could make the Tunisian economy even more fragile.
Today, we see a rise in cash payments, so that can create a problem as more people exchange money on the black market.
According to the Tunisian Central Bank, cash and coins in circulation are up 7.8% compared to last year, which may raise already steep inflation even further.
And that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Take care.